Thank you, Irene. As we have heard, we have 4 panels on where we're seeing foreign interference and the response to that. Ukraine is arguably forging the future of warfare. How is the information war playing out there? In Africa, how are foreign powers trying to use FIMI to further their aims? And how is fighting FIMI being considered as part of the international framework for defence and security? But we are starting with elections. And as Isabel has reminded us, this is the year when half the world is going to the polls. We've heard less about FIMI, though, than many had feared. Is that because the potential harms have been overplayed? Each of our panelists has a specific geographical viewpoint, a lens through which to answer that. And we will open up questions to all of you at the end. So please welcome our panelists. Filip Grzegorzewski from the European External Action Service, Jonny Hall from the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, Laura Brincourt from VIGINUM, the French agency set up to detect digital interference, who will be joining via video call, Vukosava from the Centre for Research, Transparency and Accountability, a Serbian NGO, and Kendrick Chan, who is here representing the LSE and the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change and a specialist on Taiwan. So we will start with you, Filip. What have you seen in the European elections, and how much of a problem is FIMI, and did it actually influence votes?
And how much time do you give me to answer
I give you a mere 3 minutes to answer these questions.
Thank you, Jessica. Before you start the clock, let me thank the EU delegation to the UK for an amazing job for bringing so many people to this beautiful room for a discussion on FIMI. I'm really grateful to Albena, to Federico, to Isabel, Irene. Thank you for finding money to pay for that. Now start the clock. FIMI, and in particular elections interference, is something that does not start on the day of the elections. It's a comprehensive, long-term process of interference taking place well before, during and after the elections. That's something that we have to keep in mind. So the preparations, both on the side of the threat actors, but also on our side, started well before 2024. This is why we rolled out a rapid alert system, EU versus disinfo campaigns. This is why we've published 2 FIMI threat reports. This is why we've brought together CSOs and the NGOs to work together with us in a network called ISAC. Let me give you some key observations on the elections. I'll limit myself to 3. I know we will have more time later. And then I'll be ready also to share with you some lessons learned. So we knew that Russians were coming. And guess what? They came. So we were not surprised. We knew that Russians were interested in intervening, interfering into the democratic process because they have stakes in it. As much as we have stakes in defending democracy, they had stakes in trying to disrupt the democratic process. So in the months leading to the vote, the Russian FIMI ecosystem tried systematically and repetitively to pollute the information space, to disseminate narratives discrediting or promoting specific candidates or parties, undermining the legitimacy of the electoral process, and promoting distrust in elections. So that's the first finding that we came up with. The second that I wanted to share with you is that over a 5-month period leading to the elections, the European External Action Service analyzed more than 40 concrete FIMI, foreign information manipulation interference cases related to the European elections. But the good news, as it was already said by Isabel and by Irene, and this is something that the whole community agrees on, is that those attempts were not able to seriously disrupt or pose a significant threat to the elections. Now, the third thing that I wanted to say here is that during the days of the vote, we've noticed the pro-Kremlin doppelganger campaign continuing to copycat and distort the reality, to attempt and influence the elections. And that's something very concrete, and that's a good case to say that good preparations pays off. So without excellent preparation, excellent coordination of all the institutions of the Brussels bubble and the member states and our partners beyond the European Union, we would not be able to detect it. And here we are. We've not only detected it, but we've also managed to contain the effects, the negative effects of this Russian campaign. So let me stop here. I'll be ready to come in with more, but at this stage, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Turning to you, Jonny. Jonny Hall, Director of the Cyber Information and Tech Threats Directorate at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. Clearly, the UK had elections in July, but unlike the EU, there was a relatively short notice. What are the main learnings from that, and what did you see?
Thanks, and morning everyone, and let me just start by saying thank you to EU hosts for putting this event together. A real pleasure to be here this morning. So I'm going to talk a bit about the UK, but actually also a bit about that global context, and Filip's introduction, I think, a huge amount in there that resonates, and indeed, as we know from our ongoing day-to-day cooperation across teams, actually, we share so much, and indeed all of our insight, and are very much aligned in this space. Firstly, though, I want to start by actually coming back to the opening remarks. So 2024 was badged as the year of elections, the year in which we'd see the FIMI threat really manifest. And I think a couple of reflections on that. Firstly, that shows, I think, the huge progress that we talked to here about our ability as a community to understand, raise awareness, and actually build the cooperative mechanisms necessary to look at this threat. So the fact that we knew it was coming, the fact that attention was raised, the fact that this was a core part of public policy dialogue, foreign policy dialogue, defence and security dialogue running into 2024 is actually a key conclusion, I think, from our side in terms of what has happened. Now, kind of what does that mean in practice? So, as Filip says, we knew in Europe and across Europe the Russians were coming. We have seen and been increasingly looking at and paying attention to Russian tactics, techniques, procedures over many, many years, but then clearly in real sharp focus over the last 2.5 years since they have stepped up and escalated their information activity in advance of their invasion of Ukraine and since. And what we saw was a continuation of what they have been doing persistently, whether that is attempting to exploit wedge issues across democracies across the continent, but also alongside a kind of disregard for democracy and a willingness to use any gaps they could see to their advantage, a continued focus on their narratives around Ukraine and actually pushing those issues into every environment possible. Now, also similarly, actually, as we look across the continent, if we look at the impact of that, we see the intent, but actually how much impact was there when it comes to elections? Question mark, but doesn't appear to be much. But I think one of the other big takeaways that we're looking at, and as a community need to keep looking at, is while the impact in acute terms, in terms of into an electoral moment, appears to be limited, what we need to continue to focus on is, as Filip says, actually what has been and is the corrosive impact on democracy, resilience, public discourse as a nature of that activity, and what does that actually mean, what damage is that doing? So, you know, our elections are important moments, but our elections do not equal democracy. And as a key takeaway, frankly, understanding the fabric of our discourse and how we protect that. Now, a couple of words, if I may, on that, just to frame some of what follows. So I think what's been striking to us here in the UK is actually the scale and progress, as I say, both of our own development, of our understanding of this problem set, the tools and levers necessary, but actually also the international cooperation mechanisms to deal with that. And we are seeing, I think, really significant strides forward in how we're able to tackle this threat. If I think back 2.5 years ago, looking at Russia's impending invasion of Ukraine, A lot of focus around strategic communications against a disinformation problem, pre-bunking, debunking of narratives, and so on. Strategic communications, very important. But the challenge we're looking at is not a communications problem. The challenge is an interference problem of which communications of the narrative is a component part. So really important, but actually that means equally, and the growth of work, looking at understanding the networks involved, the malign behavior, the inauthenticity, the covert influence, and actually how across our systems we can investigate that, identify it, and put in place the tools to actually take action against the networks and the actors involved. And we've seen this most recently, I think, in terms of activity that the UK has done with US and Canadian partners in looking at Moldova, and looking at Russia today. We see that obviously across the international community. And I think continuing and growing that toolkit to actually expose but then disrupt the actors involved in this will be really important. And then the final thing I'd say that is in some ways an obvious conclusion, but a very important one to bring us back to. I think as we look out beyond 2024, coming back to the importance of that whole of society set of approaches where we look at how government takes action, and government action to defend our democracy has been a key focus in 2024, but actually government's partnership with academia, civil society, private sector, as well as internationally, and how we look at short, medium, and long-term responses running through this. Now, those are things that we have known for some time, but I come all the way back again to the introductory comments. How we build the correct capabilities, the investment at scale, the partnerships across our institutions, our organisations, that and the set of lessons that come from 2024, I think, is the challenge now ahead of us.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jonny. Right, we will now turn to Serbia.
Okay, yeah.
Crnjanski is the director of the Centre for Research, Transparency and Accountability. Vuka, what are the main narratives in Serbia and who is spreading them?
Yeah, it's a good question, but if I can use this opportunity to thank you for actually being here and having this great place to share actually the information and data that we collected. So when you said at the very beginning, about support, this is the most important thing. So for us who are practitioners on the ground, of course, financing and support is really important, but being with us is more important. Because, very often we feel alone, because yes, we have FIMI, but we also have actually symbiosis between our government and, for example, Russia. So when we talk about who is spreading this information, Serbia is, I would say, one of the very specific cases. So first, we have elections almost every year. So it's not because of political crisis, but the election is actually the way how our government is governing. So this is, let's say, first difference than when you compare with other countries. So we live campaign, we live elections, and it's important to actually understand in which media environment and information environment these elections are actually happening. So when I say symbiosis, and when I say, yes, we have FIMI, but government is most important, I would just like to, illustrate this relativization that we actually, of information that we live in. So war in Ukraine helped us to see obvious. So we are fertile ground for disinformation. For example, I think most of the audience understand when I mentioned Račak. So, this was the reason for bombing Serbia. But in our country, relativization of Račak actually was used for relativization of Bucha. So for Serbian citizens, Bucha actually was staged or didn't happen. So, these are the things when we talk about the FIMI. But, this symbiosis, and to go on what's going on with our government, is actually that, we are flooded with disinformation. And disinformation is on our mainstream media. And what we were trying to actually understand is, those disinformation are contributing to which narratives. And then we understood that actually as a candidate country, what you wouldn't expect is that actually these information are serving to vilify first political vest to undermine the EU efforts. Then, like the second narrative, or like the dominant narrative, is actually to vilify the regional actors. So it's always, like using opportunity that, I don't know, Kosovo Albanians or Croats or Bosniaks, like someone is trying to attack Serbia. The third narrative is also like linked with vilifying domestic opponents, so anyone who dare to criticize the government policies. And then all those three are actually contributing to build the cult of personality of one man. So when we talk about, like disinformation and actually, like a spreading of this, so the public official, domestic public official, and media are the main channels for spreading disinformation. So I guess, like my time is there, so I'm happy to answer all
Fantastic.
questions.
Kendrick, now to Taiwan, which held presidential elections at the start of the year. Given the intense interest from China, how does FIMI manifest itself there?
Yeah, first of all, thanks very much, for the invitation to be here, to speak on this panel, and also thank you very much to the audience for, being here. On the question of Taiwan with regards to the election, what I have seen, right, is that there actually is a differing, divergent in narratives that are coming out. So on one hand, with regards to the older generation, right, it's about China is a friend, China being the People's Republic of China, the PRC is a friend, and they're an ally and they are family, and family can work out their differences, etc., etc. But for the younger generation, it's disinformation campaigns. It's not about portraying China as a friend. It's about recasting the US or the West broadly as an unreliable ally, to say like, hey, your leaders in Taiwan are leading you onto the path of war, a war that you cannot win. Right? It's about sowing that mistrust in the government institutions over there. So that's the first thing we see. So there's two more. And the second one is that we have to realize that, especially for the Taiwanese context, right? Disinformation is a very lucrative, I hesitate to use the word industry here, but it's a very lucrative sector, because imagine you are an agricultural, plant owner, right? You own a farm, that does a lot of export of fruits, etc., and you get invited over to the mainland China, and they tell you, hey, you know what? We are friends. We don't discuss politics. I just want to give you businesses. I just want to give you business. I want to buy your exports. So they're changing the way they think, because they go back to Taiwan and they said, you know what? I went over there. It was fine. We didn't discuss politics. It was just about business. So why would you think about them, in political terms? So they really are changing. There's this very strong economic dimension. I could also go on about, the restoration of certain temples in Taiwan, about how temples are actually one of the main attack vectors or spreaders for information manipulation. And the third thing is that there is also, to some degree, a trust gap between the government and the citizens, right? And not so much, it's less in Taiwan, but more prevalent in other societies. But the gap is still there, which is that in a democracy, you see citizens being, very cautious. They are careful if, a single source of truth, like a top-down, government instituted, government says, like this is the truth, everything else is fake news. Citizens in a democracy are very wary of that, and rightly so. So, and you have that, and you have the polarization of politics that takes place in societies, and you see that gap growing. So, of course, and Taiwan, has a lot of strong civil society organizations that can help to bridge this gap, because civil society organizations, they could then say to people, hey, you know what, we are one of you, we are literally one of you, right? And they are building up this shared threat picture that can then enable government institutions across both parties, right, and political parties as well, to work together to tackle this threat. I think that is very, very important to do, considering the amount of polarization that's going on in democracies nowadays. Bridging that gap, right, coming together, bipartisanship. So I'll stop there for now.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Finally, Laura, who is joining us remotely, Laura Brincourt is Deputy Head of Coordination and Strategy Bureau VIGINUM in France. She's looked at FIMI across 3 major events in France, the EU elections, the French parliamentary elections, but also the Olympics. So from your point of view, Laura, tell us what you've seen.
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
So first of all, sorry I couldn't make it to London, so I hope the connection won't let us down, but tell me if you lose my connection. So I'll try to be quick to leave some room for discussion. But so as you know, we had 2 major elections in France this year. So we covered first the EU elections and then the early legislative election. So of course, elections are the symbol of democracy. They are a marker of the health of a society. So it's a particularly interesting moment to observe manipulation of information campaigns. But you mentioned another key moment for us, besides the elections, was the organization of the Olympic Games. So maybe just a few words about the elections. We observed multiple campaigns during this period for both elections. Our analysis now, looking at the past, is that most of them were very opportunistic maneuvers. Most of them were trying to raise and amplify already existing divisive issues or already existing controversies, but they were quite opportunistic. Other campaigns that we observed were more planned and prepared, and I think that one of the panelists mentioned that it was interesting to observe that some of the already existing schemes of manipulation of information, such as doppelganger, for instance, or portal combat, were reactivated during this period. So this is why it's important to look and to monitor manipulation of information campaigns during elections, but it's more of a long-term work for them, and sometimes they just activate already existing schemes. So even if we observed multiple campaigns, our conclusion is that none of them really hindered the smooth running of the elections. None of them really had an impact, at least an immediate impact on the elections. Even if we observed some patterns that we also observed patterns and modus operandi in the Olympic Games. If I have like 2 minutes to talk about the Olympic Games, this was a particularly interesting period for us, because from an international perspective, the Olympic Games were held in a very difficult geopolitical context, marked with the persistence of international conflicts, but also they came right after our election. So even internally, it was a rather special period. As a consequence, the Olympic Games were, of course, a very positive event for France and for its image, but it was also an unprecedented opportunity for malign actors to attack France and to trying to divide the population around controversial issues such as immigration, gender issues, and things like that. It was the perfect timing to try to sow confusion among the population. So given the magnitude of this event, we were prepared. Preparation is also key. One of the panelists emphasized that. I completely agree. We were prepared on different scenario and on different strategies that the actors may use in this kind of international event. Finally, looking back for the Olympic Games, we can say that the Games were the object of multiple malign operations, but none of them really hindered, again, the success of the game. Overall, VIGINUM detected 43 information manipulation campaigns or maneuvers. So you can think it's a lot. Again, most of them were opportunistic. Some of them were more planned or coordinated. But our overall assessment is that most of these campaigns, and it was the same for the elections, they really tried to target specific national audience. in order to leverage already existing cognitive biases in these audiences, because they knew that some narratives would be more receptive to this kind of narratives. They would easily share this kind of narratives. So in terms of viewership, most operations observed remain in their specific ecosystem. And this is a really important outcome for us, because when we're trying to assess, which is very difficult, when we're trying to assess the impact of manipulation of information campaigns, one of the criteria that we're looking at is how a maneuver or a campaign is able to penetrate a new ecosystem and to reach a new audience beyond its usual audience. And both for the Olympics and both for the election periods, most of the operations observed were not able to reach new audience. So this is a good news. This is the assessment that we have, even if we observe multiple maneuvers, a tendency to use multi-platform, a lot of operating method, and things like that. So yeah, but our overall assessment is that they did not hinder the smooth running of the elections or of the Olympic Games.
Thank you, Laura. That's really interesting. I'm going to ask a couple of questions before I come to your questions. So first of all, Kendrick, can you tell us a little bit more about emerging technologies? Not what we will see, but what we are seeing in terms of emerging technologies from your point of view and what you've considered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on the topic of emerging technology, it's a very interesting one, because as someone who was technically trained in a previous life, I see developments that are happening now that are actually quite worrying, right? So the most familiar or most visible form of emerging tech that we can see is large language models, LLM, ChatGPT being the most popular and widely used manifestation of that. And I see that the emerging of technologies like LLM specifically, right? They have actually caused people to think less. So in other words, people trust what they are seeing already without interrogating. I'm going to put this question to ChatGPT, and I'm going to take whatever that's coming out of the dialogue box, right, as the answer. And people lose that ability to think critically, to basically interrogate your sources. That's one. And the second one that we see with regards to emerging technology, another trend, which has FIMI implications, is that the private sector moves at a much faster pace than government institutions, than policy makers, right? So they are able to develop technology faster than policymakers can respond. What does this mean? This means that the bulk of technical expertise, for a sector like FIMI, for a domain like FIMI, which is, you see that because they can move so quickly, the expertise lies with the private sector, and you will see the emergence of a parallel to the hacker for hire ecosystem over there. And we are already seeing signs of this happening for FIMI. What do I mean? I speak, from the Chinese example. I drop on China's example, is that you have private companies who understand the nature of the internet, how to gain virality, how it basically works, right? How can you actually go about, utilizing the trust that already exists in peer networks to actually sow and seed disinformation. So what these companies are doing with regards to the government is that they use market mechanisms. So they said, okay, here's a contract, to spread a certain narrative. Here's a contract, and companies are free to bid on this. So very interestingly, for a communist regime, they are using market mechanisms, capitalizing upon the technical capabilities of these companies and letting them compete to see who can deliver the best results. And these are all measurable, quantitatively. You could see how many likes, how many viewers, etc., etc. So in this sense, not just LLMs, but also platforms themselves. All of this leads up, I don't want to sound entirely doom and gloom here, but it does come across as like, a quite bleak-looking picture for the information ecosystem as we move forward.
Thank you. Turning to Jonny and Filip, can you give us a sense of how the threat actors are learning from each other, and are there particular ways in which you can see patterns? Filip?
Let me start, and I'm sure that Jonny will say much more than me, but the fact that we are sitting now on stage with Kendrick, with whom we met in Taipei, not that long time ago, where we were talking about China as the threat actor, and now we focus more on Russia. It means that there is a common thread there, and that those threat actors actually share TTPs. They do share their tactics, techniques, and procedures, because the goal is the same at the end of the day. The goal is to disrupt democracy. And the way to do it, the most efficient and effective way to do it, is to disturb, to ruin trust. Trust in institutions, trust in the system. We talked today about the elections in particular, but it goes beyond elections. What I admire about the Taiwanese society, where I spent the last 5 years, is that they were able to make democracy, the values, as part of their DNA. And that made them extremely resilient to disinformation attacks. So when you look at individual campaigns, when you look at misinformation or disinformation or malinformation, because we have to be specific what we are talking about, FIMI versus those mis, dis, and malinformation, it's not the same. But when you look at those different bits and pieces of information which are simply not true, in most of the cases in Taiwan, they don't really have much of an effect on the society, because people there believe in democracy. I'm not saying it's their religion, but it's part of their core values. And that's something that we in Europe, we should also build, and that would increase enormously our resilience. One point just to end, as much as those threat actors align, as much as they learn from each other in adopting different TTPs to attack democracy, we, on the democratic side, we do the same. So we have different ways of cooperating. We have in Europe RAS network, we have ISAC, and within the global community, we have the G7 with rapid response mechanism. And the fact that we sit here now in London, and we could basically swap our speaking points with Jonny, that means that we are exactly on the same page, and we see the threat of FIMI in exactly the same way. And just the last sentence in this intervention, just wanted to thank you very much for adopting FIMI and taking FIMI as your own, and it makes me so happy and proud to hear FIMI being used as your own approach to what we see, the threats that democracy is under. So thank you for that.
Filip, thank you, and I'll start where Filip left off, which is I do think I will get to the question in a second, but actually the adoption of things like common terminology is, and it sounds very bureaucratic, but actually is one of the most important steps forward, I think, across this community that we've been developing over the last 2 years. It is borderline impossible, I think, to get after a problem like this if you aren't actually able, as a community across countries, institutions, regions, to actually define the problem in the same way, and particularly when you get to something as complex as dis, mis, mal, and all the things that could be information related. And actually really understanding as a community that we are talking about a specific subset, a component that is interference, that is then in the information domain, if that makes sense, has been really important. And genuinely, actually, the work that the External Action Service has done actually to develop our lexicon has been genuinely fantastic. And not just looking at kind of how we are now on the same page, but actually, looking at other colleagues in the audience, whether US colleagues or others, actually the fact that we are talking the same language, as it were, is really important. Look, to the question, proliferation of techniques, common operating methods from hostile actors. I think it's something that we do see and something that we need to be really aware of. You know, clearly as we see, say, Russia developing and driving new ways of doing things as they have on a consistent basis over the last 3 years in particular, and actually in response to what we collectively have done, we need to be really, really alive to the fact that others are clearly watching and others will take those techniques, but similarly in the other direction, actually, as other hostile actors are, as other panelists have said, looking at what is, for instance, going on in Taiwan. But I do think at the same time, there's a really important point in here that I think somebody else on the panel picked up on. What I think we're seeing is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all model that works for a hostile actor attempting to perpetrate FIMI. So where you have impact, regional and contextual specific approaches are the only things that cut through, if that makes sense. So what will play well in, well, actually, for instance, in Serbia or in the Balkans is going to be very different from what will work in, say, the UK. And that will be very different from what works in Taiwan. Because actually, to have impact, it is the landing into the local context, into local political issues that will be key. So yes, common kind of learning, as it were. But actually also, I think in many ways, the challenge for us is to make sure that we are consistently applying the audience and the threat kind of theatre, as it were, to the lens as well, and using that to understand how we develop our approaches. There are things that we can do as states to the networks and the perpetrators, but actually in terms of impact and what will land, as Filip says, even though that is really difficult to look at, that is going to vary very, very differently, whether that's in Europe, whether that's in Africa, as I think we're all increasingly concerned about in terms of the scale of hostile activity that we are seeing, and actually that we haven't necessarily looked at to the degree that we should have done over many years. I think we're all turning our attention there, but also other parts of the global south. So yes, but would be my answer. I think, though, it is particularly key as we're trying to work out what the nature of emerging and disruptive technology actually is. And so, again, while that will land in different ways in different contexts, actually we are in the foothills of understanding what generative AI will do to this set of capabilities. You know, clearly at different points, lots of concerns around deep fakes, cheap fakes, questions about how much they cut through and in what way, again, locally specific. But that, to me, is probably the big area where if you're looking at how kind of hostile actors will learn, it's the development and use of that set of technologies and what is the capability being built around us. But I would also agree with Filip, there's also an opportunity in that for us to make sure that we are actually also sharing our own common doctrine, as it were.
Fantastic. Very briefly, Laura, Vuka, what works in the Serbian context and then in the French context?
So, I mean, like, of course, it's important to have, you know, like fact checkers, to have researchers, you know, like to network, to learn from each other. But what we found out is actually, we saw when Meta started working with fact checkers on third-party program, and actually we saw that those who are spreading disinformation and who are revealed that they are doing that, they started losing money. And actually that's what we try to actually do in Serbian context with demonetization, which is, you know, like what we were looking was actually advertising, you know, like on those media who are spreading disinformation, to connect and to understand how that works. What we found out is actually that none of your help, finance, you know, like help, can actually beat what is invested through ads and advertising, just like in 2 seconds. Because we found out that political West organizations, like, you know, companies that are coming from the West, actually are financing those who are spreading disinformation.
Inadvertently, yes.
Yeah. So that's the, you know, like how we started, you know, like fighting against that, revealing that actually companies are standing next to the disinformation on the mainstream media. And also it's not just about finance, it's about legitimization of, you know, like information manipulation.
Yeah. So this is about inadvertently the ad money going next to disinformation.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Laura, very briefly, France, what's the context that's very specific to France?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question, but did you...
The question, we were talking about what some of the very specific issues about fighting FIMI effectively in different countries are, and 1 or 2 observations about France.
Well, maybe if you allow me, I'll take the question from a slightly different angle, because I think this is a subject that we're not talking or discussing a lot in this kind of conference, is what human capacities are needed to detect manipulation of information campaigns, because I think this could be applicable to France, to state entities, but also to private entities. So here I'm not going to be very objective, because I'm going to talk about VIGINUM's model, but I think it's an interesting one for discussion in terms of monitoring capabilities, although I'm sure that there are plenty of others. I think that to detect, and it's not just specific to France, to detect in the best way manipulation of information campaigns, you need a combination of skills. And for VIGINUM, for instance, just to give you an idea of how we function, on the one hand, we have analysts which are specialized in open source investigation with the most advanced techniques in the field and everything. On the other hand, they have another hat, which is the geopolitical background. They are specialized in one particular threat actor, and I think this is really important if you want to have a good understanding of the threat actor, of the strategies that this actor may use and things like that. And in addition to this combination of skills, like the analysts have this OSINT skills and geopolitical skills, we have another team which is called the Data Lab, which is composed of data scientists and data analysts who have a very different capabilities, different skills. They are here to develop tools for the analysts to better detect and observe trends, patterns, and things like that. So their angle of work is very different. It's data, but they're able to help the analysts. So I think this, you have to, and this is not just for France again, and not for governmental entities only, but I think that the combination of skills and knowing your threat actor, being specialized in one threat actor, is one of the key to monitor FIMI and informational campaigns, what to France or not.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm going to throw it now to the audience, and we've got some questions. Chris.
Hello, I'm Chris Morris. I'm the Chief Executive of Full Fact, the UK's independent fact-checking organisation, and we also build AI tools which are being used around the world to help, I guess, small groups of people deal with lots of information. As Jonny said in his opening remarks, elections do not equal democracy. And it's pretty clear that the big sort of mis- and disinformation event in the UK this summer was not the election, it was the riots in August. And I guess that emphasises the need for agility in responses. So I wonder whether you think the systems we have are agile enough. From what Filip says, it sounds like the answer in Taiwan is yes. What about in the UK and in the EU? And then secondly, it doesn't really matter how agile you are if the big internet platforms are unwilling to share the data they have about what is happening. Data about how mis- and disinformation develops, how interference develops, how narratives are created, what is most effective in stopping their spread. Now, we work with the internet platforms in a variety of ways, including third-party fact-checking, but we don't think they do enough to share data. Do you? And if you don't, what do you think can be done about it?
Okay, Jonny, I'm going to send that to you first of all.
Thank you very much. So on agility, do I think we are agile enough? No, not yet. And I think there's a real challenge as we look at the capability, the resources, the human expertise we have in balancing between understanding the drivers, the actors, the networks, the ways of tackling this systemic set of challenges, or at least the architecture that malign actors are building, with then, exactly as you say in terms of the example, the spike events that end up drawing in all attention, all resource to deal with, when actually, in many cases, by the time that is happening, it is almost an entirely different challenge that you're dealing with because it becomes a live 24/7 comms crisis issue. So have we got the right systems, the right gearing? No, it's an area where we need to keep doing more and we need to keep building that capability. I think also that's a a national problem, but actually that is to me also a key one for continuing to build international coordination, cooperation across things like the G7, but actually also, again, our public-private links there, to be honest with you, and actually how we have a system that's able to operate across these challenges.
Fantastic. We'll take some more questions. In fact, I'll take 2 or 3, I think. This gentleman here.
Hi, James Cleaver from the UK Electoral Commission. Thanks for a really interesting discussion about FIMI operations around the world. At the Electoral Commission, we don't have a remit to regulate the content of campaign material, regardless of whether it comes from domestic or foreign sources. But what we do have is an interest in public confidence in electoral processes, and we'll consider intervening if we see misleading information about this. And we think this is a bit easier to do because information about electoral processes is normally true or false. The election is on this date, you vote in this way, your polling station is at this place. And we think that's a bit easier to do than trying to look at the truthfulness of a claim or verify the authenticity of campaign material that might have been created by AI. So I have 2 questions for the panel. Just firstly, any reflections on the way in which FIMI operations might have been used to undermine public confidence in electoral processes this year? And then secondly, as I said, information about electoral processes is normally true or false. Are there specific ways in which FIMI disinformation about electoral processes can be combated? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll send that to Filip, but first of all, can I hear another couple of questions? The gentleman, this lady here. Yep.
My name is Margarita Khludiani. I'm a journalist from Georgia. I just wanted to know that maybe it's not enough to detect misinformation or disinformation. Maybe more important it is to distribute information about detected misinformation. And I can say from my own experience where I can learn about something revealed. Only getting some digest to my email. While it should be used the same approach as those who produce misinformation use, multi-platform approach. So it should be funny, it should be a lot of videos, a lot of publication in social media, but it's not done usually. And I think it's very important, it's mostly comment, not a question. Yeah, it's important to pay attention to.
Lovely, thank you. One final question. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Claire?
Thank you. Claire Melford, CEO of GDI. I wanted to add another lens which has been touched on but hasn't been pulled out enough, which is the system lens rather than the actor lens. I think various governments call it the sort of actor agnostic lens. Because regardless of what the content is or where it comes from, if it is engaging, it will be algorithmically promoted and monetized. And therefore, just focusing on who created it doesn't actually solve the problem unless you tap into the plumbing of the internet. And I'll give a very live example of this, which is all the content and the monetization of content on RT and Sputnik were sanctioned at the beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, we at GDI see RT content all over the internet, monetized by large tech platforms because it has been syndicated onto multiple other websites, translated, maybe 1 or 2 words changed. But it is the exact same content as we see on RT, and it is monetized. So that's a good example of how trying to go after an actor, because you are ignoring or not focusing on the plumbing of the internet, the way content is distributed, syndicated, and monetized, you're not actually achieving the reduction in spread or the incentive to create. So I wanted to bring in the systems focus.
Fantastic. Kendrick, do you want to answer that one?
I don't think it was a question.
Well,
it was more like
it was an observation. Yeah. Okay. Turning to you, Filip, the question around James, the Electoral Commission question, public confidence the issue is not whether you influence people, it's whether they have confidence in the entire system. And actually, when true or false, could there be much easier ways of dealing with things very quickly?
Probably yes. It would be easier if we had a Ministry of Truth. But we don't. We don't want to go that path. That's why we coined this term FIMI, Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference, and we put so much emphasis on the definitions. That's why we try to be very specific in what we are talking about. The definition of FIMI is a pattern of intentional and coordinated behavior that threatens to negatively impact political processes, procedures, and values. And it's coming from the outside. It might be conducted through proxies within your own country, but it's coming from the outside. And there's a question of agility and effectiveness of our responses. And our responses are at the crossroad of communication and security. We need to make sure that we use both instruments, both types of instruments coming from communication and security. But we also have an advantage of being able to regulate the system. We have the advantage of using other measures to prepare our societies for those attacks. And we came up with a FIMI toolbox. I don't know if you've seen it. It looks funny, it's colorful, it's beautiful. We call it a donut. And here you have all the different colors that represent different ways of responding to the threats. And the day of voting, the day of elections, is the day when we say check. But actually, the whole process leads to that day, and it takes time. The whole situational awareness is not a question of one-day event. It takes time. It takes whole community to build. The resilience building is another element where we need time, where we have to engage all the actors to build this resilience of society, to be able to withstand those attacks. And then regulation and disruption, that's also something where we need partners that we mobilize to work together in those different networks that Jonny was talking about. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Fantastic. Sorry?
More points.
Yeah, just very briefly.
Yeah, very briefly about the question of agility. I think it would be good to give due consideration into how the threat of FIMI is tackled across government, because FIMI is actually a horizontal thing, while a lot of time governments operate in vertical. I'll cite one very quick example, right, on the topic of this information spread on the internet. So I went to the Home Affairs Ministry with this issue of a particular country, and they said, you know what, this thing is coming from abroad, right? Yeah. And they said, foreign affairs problem. And I go to the foreign affairs, and they said, this sounds like a digital issue, right? Digital affairs. And I go to digital affairs, and they said, you know what, home affairs problem. So who am I supposed to go to? It sounds like something out of the series Yes Minister, but it's reality, right? So I'll stop there.
Fantastic, and that was 50 years ago. Thank you for a fascinating discussion. Thank you to all our panelists. Please grab a coffee, and at 10:30 we have our next session on FIMI and the lessons from Ukraine. So please be back on time to hear about Ukraine. Thank you.